I don't think I could do this anymore. I don't know why, but I'm okay with walking away from this because there's no way I'm dragging down the list.
On the evening of July 23, 2026, inside a packed Madison Square Garden, thousands of fans watched something none of them had paid to see. Jon Bon Jovi, a man who had spent more than 4 decades commanding arenas without flinching, stopped mid-set, stepped back from the microphone, and told the crowd he simply could not continue. Within moments, his bandmates surrounded him on stage, wrapping him in a group embrace as the arena, usually roaring, fell into a strange, uncertain hush. For a performer whose entire identity has been built on endurance, on outlasting lineup changes, industry shifts, and his own body, this was uncharted territory. And while his team quickly pointed to a sinus infection as the culprit, anyone who had followed Jon Bon Jovi's last several years knew there was a far deeper story sitting underneath that simple explanation. This was night 8 of a planned 9-show residency at Madison Square Garden, the centerpiece of the band's long-awaited Forever Tour. It marked Bon Jovi's first extended run of live shows since 2022, when a serious vocal cord problem forced him off the road entirely. What happened on July 23rd wasn't a random bad night. It was the visible tip of a struggle that had been building quietly and painfully for more than a decade. Fans who had already caught earlier nights of the residency said something felt different from Jon's very first note. The power that once defined his voice, the belting, arena-filling sound that carried songs like Livin' on a Prayer for 40 years, sounded thinner, more strained, and increasingly rough as the night wore on. Where previous shows on this same run had stretched past 2 hours and delivered 20 or more songs, this performance ran only about 90 minutes. Bon Jovi and his band made it through roughly 14 tracks before it became clear that continuing was an option. Classics like You Give Love a Bad Name and It's My Life still landed, but by the time the band approached Livin' on a Prayer, what was supposed to be the emotional peak of the night had turned into something else entirely. Before that final song, Jon addressed the crowd directly, with a level of candor rarely heard from a performer at his level. He told the audience, in his own words, that he knew he was letting them down, and that it wasn't like him to do that. He said the band was going to play one more song, and that he was going to need their help getting through it. That help arrived in an unexpected form. Pat Monahan, lead singer of the band Train, happened to be in the crowd that night as an ordinary fan. He was pulled backstage and brought out to help carry the vocals, essentially finishing Livin' on a Prayer for a man who could no longer power through it alone. Even with Monahan sharing the load, Bon Jovi still leaned heavily on the audience to get to the finish line, letting thousands of voices fill in where his own was failing. When the song ended, he told fans not to throw away their ticket stubs, promising he'd find a way to make it up to them. He hugged each member of his band, gave the crowd a thumbs up, and walked off. A short time later, representatives confirmed that a sinus infection had forced the early ending. It was a true statement, but for longtime fans and industry watchers alike, it was clearly only part of the picture. 2 nights earlier, the band had already quietly trimmed several of their biggest, most demanding songs from the setlist without any public explanation, a detail that in hindsight reads like an early warning sign nobody wanted to say out loud. To understand what really happened at Madison Square Garden, you have to go back more than 10 years to a moment that had nothing to do with singing at all. In 2013, guitarist Richie Sambora abruptly left the band, walking away hours before a scheduled performance in Calgary during the Because We Can tour. Sambora had been dealing with personal struggles for years, and he later explained that the decision came down to being present for his family, particularly his daughter. What often gets lost in that story is what his departure did to Jon's voice. Sambora wasn't simply the band's guitarist. For 3 decades, he had been Jon's vocal partner, handling harmonies and sharing the load on stage. When he left, Jon was suddenly responsible for 80 remaining tour dates essentially by himself, covering not just his own vocal parts, but all the harmonies that had always belonged to someone else. Jon has since said that everything about his voice started to change after that tour, and that even he couldn't say for certain whether the toll was more physical or psychological. By 2015, the signs were becoming harder to hide, a new breathiness in his tone, reduced volume, and moments where pitch would slip in ways it never used to. He has described feeling as though his body had quietly given out from under him, without him fully grasping how serious it had become. In the years that followed, he tried nearly everything to manage it on his own terms. Treatments ranging from laser therapy to acupuncture to vitamin regimens and collagen injections, alongside constant vocal exercise. Rather than stopping to address the root problem, he pushed through touring cycles from 2015 into 2019, performing night after night while the very instrument his career depended on kept deteriorating beneath him. There's something uniquely isolating about that kind of struggle, sensing that something is wrong with the one thing that defines your public identity, and being unable to fix it no matter how hard you try. Then came the pandemic. The 2-year touring shutdown that reshaped the entire music industry didn't give Jon's voice the rest it needed. Instead, it exposed exactly how far the decline had progressed. When Bon Jovi returned to the stage in 2022, the difference was unmistakable to anyone who had followed the band closely, and it took someone extremely close to him to finally say what needed to be said. After a 2022 arena show in Nashville, Jon walked off stage believing he had given the crowd everything he had. He turned to his wife, Dorothea, expecting reassurance. Instead, she told him plainly that it hadn't been great, and that she had seen him at his best. This wasn't it. Jon and Dorothea have been together since high school, married since 1989, and by his own account, she is the only person in his life who has never simply told him what he wanted to hear. Everyone else around a performer at that level, he has said, falls into one of a few categories: people who depend on him professionally, people who are paid to support him, or fans who desperately want to believe everything is fine. Dorothea was different. She was, in his words, the one place he could go for the unfiltered truth. What's striking is how his mind reacted to that honesty. He has said that the instant he absorbed what she told him, his first thought wasn't about seeing a doctor or taking time to rest. It was that it might be time to retire. That reaction says a great deal about the psychological weight he had likely been carrying in silence for years. When your voice isn't just your job, but the foundation of your entire identity, the fear of losing it stops being a career concern and becomes something closer to an existential one. Within days, Jon drove himself to the hospital. Not an assistant, not a scheduled consultation weeks later. He got behind the wheel and went himself, driven by a level of urgency that reflected just how much was at stake. What the doctors found once they examined his throat was more serious than he had imagined. The diagnosis was stark. One of his vocal cords had effectively atrophied. Healthy vocal cords are supposed to be roughly symmetrical, moving in parallel with similar thickness. Jon's, by contrast, had become dramatically uneven. One side had thickened considerably while the other had wasted away, leaving the stronger cord physically pushing the weaker one out of alignment every time he tried to sing. Doctors explained that some of this decline was a natural part of aging, since vocal folds do thin over time in everyone. But 4 decades of performing at an extreme level, belting out arena-sized vocals multiple nights a week, had sped up that natural process well beyond what would be typical. What made it especially difficult to accept was that Jon had always taken his vocal health seriously. He had never smoked or used drugs, consistently warmed up before shows and cooled down afterward, and had spent decades training and refining his technique. He wasn't an amateur who had abused his instrument through recklessness. And yet, it was failing anyway. The surgical solution was a procedure known as medialization, in which the surgeon placed 2 small implants made of a material called Gore-Tex alongside the outside of the vocal cords, positioned inside the neck. Jon has described the effect as something like a facelift for his vocal cords, a way of physically repositioning the weakened side, so both cords could move together again. The operation itself succeeded, but surgery was only the starting point of what turned into roughly 3 years of learning, essentially from scratch, how to use his own voice again. Even 19 months after the procedure, Jon still wasn't ready to commit to a tour, despite having new music ready to release. He has spoken about repeatedly finding small glimmers of hope, only to be knocked back by a new setback the very next day, and about needing to feel physically, mentally, and spiritually ready before stepping back on a stage. In an interview in April 2024, he went as far as saying that if his voice couldn't return to something close to what it once was, he was prepared to walk away entirely and be at peace with that decision. He compared the moment to a quarterback nearing his final pass, and said memorably that he never wanted to become the Fat Elvis, a blunt way of expressing his fear of clinging to a spotlight his body could no longer support. While Jon spent his days in vocal therapy trying to rebuild something that wasn't guaranteed to come back, something quietly remarkable was happening around him. Not one member of the band walked away during that uncertain stretch. Drummer Tico Torres stayed. Keyboardist David Bryan stayed. Guitarist Phil X, bassist Hugh McDonald, guitarist and producer John Shanks, and percussionist Everett Bradley all kept showing up to rehearsals as though a tour date were already locked in, even when there was no return date on the calendar and no promise one would ever come. Jon has since described the sacrifices his bandmates made during that period as being on an entirely different level, saying they made clear, again and again, that they were with him no matter what. Even Richie Sambora, who hadn't performed with the band since his departure back in 2013, has publicly said he would return if Jon's voice recovered, adding that he still had music ready to share if the moment ever came. More than a decade after the split that arguably set this entire chain of events in motion, the door between them was suddenly open again. That kind of loyalty doesn't just keep a tour alive, it keeps a person steady through something genuinely frightening. In October 2025, Jon appeared publicly to announce the Forever Tour, anchored by a multi-night stand at Madison Square Garden. The comeback, after years of uncertainty, was officially real. The tour opened on July 7, 2026, with no opening act, just the house lights dropping and Bon Jovi walking straight into a soulful rendition of With a Little Help from My Friends. After 4 years of silence, the choice of song carried weight far beyond nostalgia. Jon told the crowd that night that he hadn't heard a live audience in 4 years and thanked them for their patience. Early reviews were encouraging, if honest. His voice sounded different from decades past, and he moved more carefully on stage, often anchored near the mic stand or his guitar rather than sprinting across the floor the way he once had. Still, a full setlist night after night proved the comeback was real, and fans traveled from around the world to be part of the residency. But 9 shows within roughly 3 weeks is a demanding schedule for any singer, let alone a 64-year-old performer whose voice depends on surgical implants to function at all. By the 6th show, cracks were already showing, with 2 of the band's most vocally demanding songs quietly dropped from the set. By the 8th show, on July 23rd, his body made the decision that his will alone couldn't override anymore. Before leaving the stage that night, Jon made a promise to the crowd that carried real emotional weight. "Hold onto your ticket stubs," he said, because he was going to find a way to make the show up to them. Then he added something that landed even harder. He told them he felt great, and that he'd see them again soon. In the days that followed, the tour's final scheduled Madison Square Garden show and all 5 European stadium dates, including stops in Edinburgh, Dublin, and multiple nights at London's Wembley Stadium, remained on the calendar. The financial and emotional cost of canceling any of those shows would be significant, not only for the band, but for the enormous number of fans who had already booked flights and hotel rooms to be there. Yet Jon had drawn a clear line for himself back in 2024. He said he never wanted to be the artist who kept performing through visible decline out of pride or obligation, repeating that he refused to become the Fat Elvis. The same man who once drove himself to the hospital out of sheer desperation to save his voice was now facing an eerily similar decision all over again. The sinus infection was the immediate, technical explanation for what happened at Madison Square Garden. But the deeper story is about something much bigger. A man who has spent 4 decades refusing to give audiences anything less than everything he has, now confronting a rebuilt, imperfect instrument that may not always be able to keep that promise. Jon Bon Jovi's career has always been defined by resilience. He's the kid from Sayreville, New Jersey, who once opened for ZZ Top at Madison Square Garden back in 1983 and went on to sell more than 100 million records worldwide. He has weathered lineup changes, the loss of original bassist Alec John, such in 2022, a decade of quiet vocal decline, career-threatening surgery, and years of grueling rehabilitation that pushed him right to the edge of walking away for good. He has said before that 60 feels very different from 50, and that his greatest fear was losing the ability to sing altogether. something he said would be devastating if it ever became permanent. Whether the Forever Tour truly lives up to its name or becomes remembered as the final chapter of one of rock's most remarkable careers depends entirely on what his voice can withstand in the weeks ahead. And right now, the only person who genuinely knows that answer is the same man who stood at the edge of that Madison Square Garden stage, hand on his chest, choosing to tell the truth instead of pretending everything was fine.